Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of Sparks, Entertainment and Art, where we look at so many different aspects of the band Sparks from so many different perspectives. And we've had journalists and fans and members of the band and so many other folks who have been with us. And today, I think we are really fortunate. We have with us Daryl Easlea, who wrote what I would still consider the definitive biography of the band, which is right here. Talent is an Asset, Sparks. Talent is an Asset, the story of Sparks, which has now been reprinted. And we're going to talk about that too and what led to it. But before we do any of that, I think Daryl is someone who doesn't need a lot of introduction. He's an esteemed journalist. He's a writer. He's done many things in the music industry and elsewhere. And let's get right to it. So, Daryl, may I welcome you to the show?
Well, what an absolute pleasure to be here. Lovely to see you in real life. Well, on this screen, Monte.
Yes. And I'll let people know. Daryl and I were talking before we started to do this interview, and Daryl really did a lot of research on the show. He really went through it and listened to some of the episodes. So thank you for that.
Oh, my absolute pleasure. I mean, esteemed company, and as I said to you, I love the way you sort of unpack every guest's story, and the fact that there are so many stories to tell and so many different angles that can be taken. So yeah, it's lovely to be here.
Well, you've captured the essence of the show in one sentence. I love talking to the fans as well as everyone else.
Sure.
But today we're talking to you. So I'm going to put the focus on you. And thank you again for being here. And let me start with the most obvious question is, what led you to write this book?
The short story is I was in music retail for years, so I wasn't a writer. I didn't sort of leave college to go and be a writer. I was a writer in my spare time and for, local fanzines and stuff like that. But I was always a music fan foremost. And I went to work for record shops, in the great boom of the 80s and 90s. So I sold records, and I understood, I was right there. I was there with all the new releases. I was current and up to date and still writing. I went to university in the year 1997 when I was 31, and I started writing sort of full time from that. And I met someone. And we started talking books, and they said, well, who would you really like to write books about? And my first and foremost was Chic. I really believed that Nile Rodgers and Chic,
Sure.
This is 2002, 2003, before, Nile became the sort of, as recognised as he was.
Mm-hmm.
But I felt it was Chic and Sparks were the two artists I really wanted to cover, because I think there was a sort of similarity, even though, they're musically can be poles apart. Just the quality of ideas, just the way they seem sort of quite insular within a scene, and obviously Sparks have moved through many scenes over the years. And it was a story that just absolutely fascinated me. So once I got the opportunity to, I got my sort of first book under my belt, which is, amazing. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I think your first book's always your favourite because it's such a voyage of discovery. Then Omnibus, who in Britain, very esteemed music publisher. They've been going since the 70s. Gentleman called Chris Charlesworth, who's the editor-in-chief then. Again, he'd been Melody Maker's New York correspondent in the 70s. And, tales fall out of him like, I don't know... someone who knows a lot of things and has been a lot of places. And he commissioned me, had a lovely chat about it, and sort of off I went. And what I wanted to do, because they have always sort of presented themselves in such a fashion, so, this is their view and this is how it is. I didn't, I wasn't like going into the Hollywood lot and looking at the wooden struts behind what you see out front. But, they collaborated with so many people, even though people think, they're like the ultimate duo. They've they very rarely worked just as two people. They've worked with, even if it's just an engineer, a producer, or a drummer. There's always been someone in the pot with
Hmm.
them. And that was a tremendous amount of people. So it's a long answer to a short question, but they fascinated me. I was a huge fan.
Yeah, that comes across. You are clearly a big fan of this band.
I am, but I'm always really conscious when a fan writes that suddenly, I didn't want it to be a hagiography. It wasn't authorized in the sense that, hey, and then they did this record, it was brilliant, and
Hmm.
because they're almost like the ultimate band that had highs and lows, and there was lots of records of theirs I like less than other records I like.
Sure.
But I was 8 when This Town Ain't Big Enough for the Both of Us came on Top of the Pops. Well, I said the both of us, didn't I? Town Ain't Big Enough for both of us. -5 points. And I was one of those people. I couldn't believe it. My dad, who'd fought in the war, was huffing and puffing in the background, saying that bloke looks like Hitler, and all of that. All of the things that John Lennon was supposed to have said, was happening in my living room.
Which you dispel in your book, by the way.
Well,
Not to go off on a tangent, but you kind of call it into question a little bit.
Well, he can't. I mean, he did. I was trying to pinpoint what he might have seen them on, and there was that late night show that Ringo introduced him with Keith
Sure.
Moon, which was much much later. In that period of time, everything sort of happened within 2 years, but it was later than the first sort of May '74 Top of the Pops appearances, and he'd been in America by 3 years then, and it wasn't on cable anyway. That's by the by. Never let the truth get in the way of a good story. But that was me there seeing them, and it was like, oh my god, what's this? And trying to convey that, and I say in the introduction, people have Mick Ronson when Bowie puts his arm round him, or when you first see the Pistols, or whatever those things were, the Beatles for the older generation. It was like, my God, what's this? I'd never seen this before. And bear in mind, in Britain then, we only had 3 TV channels, and Top of the Pops was watched. I mean, you conveyed that really well to one of your guests. You did watch it because there was nothing else to watch, and so everything was sort of filtered through that lens that you saw it was on a Thursday night, and then you went into school the next day and talked about it. But I think the very fact that these people looked like they'd come from another planet because they looked so square. Well, Ron looked so square, and then Russ sashaying in his kimono or whatever it was. It was
Well,
like,
you
oh,
talk about that in the book about the appearance that they make. I think you say something like one looks like an accountant and one looks like an accountant unleashed or something along those lines. I can't remember the exact quote, but it
an
was
accountant at the weekend. Yeah, that
yeah,
sounds. Yeah,
yeah.
that sounds like.
But
Or a
it's
defrocked accountant.
it's always interesting to hear people recount that incident, and it seems to have made such an impression on so many people. And it's hard to imagine that now, certainly.
Well, people say that can never happen again. And the thing is, something like that's happening everywhere at the moment. It's on a YouTube channel or it's on TikTok, and, millions of people might see it, but then they'll move immediately on to the next thing, where
Mm.
then, you had a memory of it. You couldn't get to see it again, certainly over here, and you had to wait till they were on again to see what was happening next.
So you had this experience, and it stuck with you. And while many people would say, "Boy, that was something else," you went out and wrote a book
Yeah.
many
I
years
mean,
later.
lots of things happened in between.
Of course, yeah.
But I mean, I say what interests me is, my favorite music has to have some strong form of identity and some eccentricity behind it. And also, I do love a tune.
Yeah.
I think that's really important, and I think there's a thread in all my books that all the main artists I've written about, all know how to write a great pop tune, and you can't deny the power of Ron. When he puts his mind to it, he can just sort of knock out, some beauties, and then like some of the greatest writers, then will corrupt it in some way to make it less beautiful. And Russell's voice is an acquired taste, as we've always said,
yeah.
Morrissey he sang in French italics or whatever. But long answer. In that middle period, why I wanted to write a book on them, I just think they are fascinating, and the fact that you start. People have likened them to a long marriage, and things like that. And in a long marriage, you aren't with the same person you met when you were 18 or whatever it was. You go through different phases, and some marriages don't last because those shifts are that big, and that stops. Or you sort of grow together, you get over it and do it. And when you think, we start off on the west coast of America, and then we move to grimy 3-day week London, and then we go back to sort of New York to try and be a power pop band. Then we go back to LA to be the poster boy band with the Session Men, and then we get Giorgio on case. It's like all these different bands.
Well, you cover all those phases so well in the book.
Thank you.
And I think one of the great things that you brought was the interviews. Was that, were people receptive to talking and really seeing was it something people did enthusiastically?
Oh, very much so. I think the thing is, and what's fascinating was this was the last book I wrote, which was sort of it wasn't pre the internet because it very much existed, but it wasn't like the ease now where, I'm doing some sleeve notes at the moment. And you think, what about that engineer? I wonder where he is. And, I'm talking to him the next day because there's an email. So whereas you could get maybe the big hitters, if you like, the obvious ones, you couldn't get a lot of people. So it was really hard to get, and like trying to find Giorgio Moroder, which I couldn't get him in the end, but it was going round and doing that. But it was, people were open to talk because they're not asked very often. It wasn't like, I don't know, Pete Best being asked what was it like not to be in the Beatles anymore. People hadn't been asked about them for 30, 40 years and were genuinely absolutely delighted to share that feeling. I mean, now since the Edgar Wright film, sort of, if you don't talk about Sparks, there's something wrong with you. At that time, trying to get anyone to sort of talk and come forward was brilliant.
What I'm hearing you say, with some exceptions, and we can talk about that, but
Okay.
With some exceptions, many of the bandmates, even some like a Trevor White, who was with them for just a short time and believed there was more that could be done, he was still looked back on that period very fondly. Whereas someone like an Ian Hampton is very clear. He has very high regard for that.
Mm.
But Trevor, if you look, it seems like he also is a little bit nostalgic, or this is a 2010 book. So,
well, I think they all felt, what a great thing that they were in Sparks, and they hadn't been in Sharks, although Sharks were all right in their day. But of all the bands to be in, I think any band which has longevity like that, and when you think, everything your listeners and viewers know, how they've remained, the cottage industry within the music industry have kept being original, have kept, all their other bands have, gone on nostalgia tours, and they've gone on, the fact they've stayed so true to themselves, which makes those ex-musicians or ex-members of Sparks think, I picked the right horse there. I wasn't in Arrow or the Arrows or Sherbet or whoever. When we first saw Sparks, they were a band. I think, Digby Smith said that very well, that he had no idea they'd just been sort of plucked from Melody Maker a few weeks before.
Yeah.
And I certainly think Martin Gordon thought initially, he was, if not an equal, certainly a key player in the process. But then it sort of gradually revealed itself like one of those mystery paintings or whatever, that it was going to be the brothers and everyone else would be, supporting their vision.
That kind of segues into something that I think about a lot. And I know we've discussed it I've discussed it with people on prior shows, but that is something you talk about quite a bit in your book, which is that what you say is that since they took over their career in 2002, they have become the artistic institution that they always wanted to be. And you also speak very highly of Little Beethoven, the album, for why wouldn't you? Uh,
Mm.
but I think that's something very fascinating, that they kind of led to that with some of the steps that they took in terms of building their own studio and getting away from the labels. And what are you getting at when you say that?
Well, I think, you know, Sparks have been with some very big labels in their time. Even though I say very big labels, they were all in sort of like, you know, the an interesting compartment of a big label. So Bearsville with Warner, Ireland was part of EMI, even though it was independent with Chris Blackwell. Virgin was sort of independent, but working with like blah blah blah. But they'd work with the big boys, and I think the thing is, when you work with labels, labels want certain things from artists, and invariably that's a hit. They want a return on their investment. And there's a lot of very experienced people in labels with a lot of ideas and opinions. Now, when you're 23, 24, that's great. You know, it's all part of a team. And, you know, you hear it on your interview with Muff that when suddenly you're working with someone like Muff who's got those ideas and can really support you and help you with them, then it's brilliant. And Visconti, of course, doing it on Indiscreet. I mean, I think that's one of, you know, such a phenomenal production. But then I think when you get older and you have, you know, guided your career to a point, you know, it just became so sort of obvious that that's what they needed to do because, you know, I remember, and this is, you know, when I really fell in love with Sparks again was you know, I started work at Record Collector in the year 2000 and Balls had just come out. And it wasn't, you know, I'd followed them, I knew everything, but it was a bit like it wasn't all Sparks. Are they still going? But it was a bit like, okay, yeah, all right, they're doing it. So when Little Beethoven came out, I remember it coming into the office. It was a bit like, well, who's going to review this then? And I said, well, I'll give it a listen. You know, I'll see what we got with no expectations whatsoever. And I think that was the best thing about it. You know,
Yeah.
the expectations were fairly low. And of course, you know, I think I gave it a full page review, and you know, the first of many glowing reviews it got. And I'm not saying, you know, hey, I'm part of the process of it getting back, but I then interviewed them for the first time around that time, and you know, they're just in the way, you know, considering it was like 20, well, nearly 30 years into their, it was 30 years into their career. I mean, bands 30 years into their career, you know, we still at that point weren't very used to it. You know, people don't have careers 30 years old, and when they do, to make something as different as that,
Yeah.
and a statement as much as that, and the way repetition was used. I mean, I know that they've used that throughout their career, but almost to the point of just minimizing everything to repeating the title of the song. I think My Baby's Taking Me Home. I did actually count it for the book because I was fascinated, and I
Mhm.
can't remember. I think it's 133 times or
Is
something.
that
That
right?
phrase is repeated. I can check it out. Put it in the comments. And it was just amazing. I couldn't quite believe what they'd done, and because they were the success. I mean, maybe had it not been successful, then something else would have happened. But I think that gave them the impetus to go on their own. And the other factor in that is Sue Harris as their manager,
Yeah.
because Sue is their longest running manager
Yeah.
now. And Sue is fabulous, and she's no nonsense. She comes from PR, a PR background, so she knows how to sort of, you know, sell what's happening. And I think she's just encouraged them to follow, you know, follow this course they've been on. And it's almost like encouraging them every way with every sort of idea and making them do things, you know, like the 21 Nights thing, I think was her idea because they'd started doing that.
Really? I didn't
Well,
realize that.
you know, I don't know if it was her idea, but she joked it or something, because you'd already started having Brian Wilson doing, you know, Pet Sounds as a piece, and people were doing that. And she said something like, well, why don't you do all 21 albums as a piece? And, you know, after sort of saying no, it was just the sort of thing that they would do, you know. And that was so fascinating to see. I think I saw 4 of them. I mean, I could have gone more, but I didn't live, you know, it was a journey in. But I mean, it was amazing because it was in a small-ish venue, and to see them, and you know, I remember going for Number One in Heaven and just not being able to breathe. It was so busy in there. But interior
You
design,
talk about that in the book. Yeah.
and interior design, there was about 5 of us. But you know, that's the joy of Sparks. You know, that's absolute joy of it. But I think Sue has guided them very, very firmly and let them have their head. You know, it hasn't said, boys, you know, you need to go on this primetime quiz show and, you know, do that.
So my impression from what you're saying, she doesn't put pressure on them to have a hit. You know, like, here's what we got to do. We got to get you on that. She respects them and wants people to be accepted for what they do.
As I see it, yes, but obviously she's aware of the tricks of the trade, and obviously
Sure.
the you know, the album performances over here in recent years. I mean, Mad at Number 2, it's like, you know, will they get that number 1 album in Britain? But you know, it's absolutely phenomenal to think that Mad could do that after 55 years or whatever it was. I mean, just, you know, wow,
Yeah.
and proper wow, not like, you know.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's that's a more refined perspective from what I was saying, that she is aware of that, and you know, and they have had success, just like you're describing. I mean, since you wrote the book, they just keep going. They haven't slowed down a bit.
Well, you know, the book ended initially at Ingmar Bergman had just come out, and again, that was one of the, you know, amazing left field turns. It's a bit like, oh yeah, let's make a radio play about, you know, let's be honest, a cult film director. I mean, you know, we probably disproportionately love him, but it's like, oh, okay, you know, that's a long way from Beat the Clock. But is it? You know, discuss.
Well, I love how favorably you talk about that album, because I think it's brilliant. I think it's a brilliant thing to do, just out of the blue. All of a sudden, you get that.
Well, I think that's, you know, as I said, you know, when I came back to the book, you know, expect the unexpected or whatever, and now for my next trick, you know, they are showmen. They grew up with their stepfather in the novelty shop.
Yeah.
You know, and it's like every album is a new pair of glasses where the eyes come out on springs, or, you know, it's a whoopee cushion or something. That they put that element of surprise in what they do, and I think that's what absolutely, you know, endears the hardcore to them.
Yeah.
And, you know, has that amazing thing that, you know, they sporadically pop up beyond their fan base. Like when Glastonbury happened over here, it was all televised and live, and obviously Kate Blanchett coming out and doing,
Right.
you know, Latte.
Right.
You know, it's like, you know, the two things are they still going? Yes, they are. Is that Kate Blanchett? Bloody hell! You know, it's not like they're still going and they've got, you know, someone from a soap opera on there. They've got Oscar-winning, globally known megastar Kate Blanchett dancing with them, and that's when, you know, when they do surface, it's always in a sort of, you know, an element of surprise and you know, what's coming next.
Well, as a member of that hardcore, I can tell you that that's exactly right. That's one of the things that we love about them, you know,
Yeah.
and that given that they do it so consistently well, doesn't mean they have to do every album has to be a masterpiece. It just means we know that they've really worked hard on something new that expresses what they want to express at any given time, and it's just a joy to listen to. And
I know exactly what you mean. It's like, you know, already they weren't making the same album by the time of Indiscreet. I mean,
well,
I think
1975,
Propaganda,
yeah,
you know, is fairly Kimono Part 2 broadly. Again,
yeah,
that can be, you
yeah.
know, the first 2 albums are a piece, those 2 albums are a piece, and then you get sort of virtually every album different. Obviously, Terminal Jive is #1, Part 2, and then you get the American little similarity era. But each album is different and it has its own specific joy.
I think that's part of the fun of being a fan, which you talked about Indiscreet. And that's what did it for me. Cause it's like,
Yeah,
okay, the first two albums are kind of like the last two albums I've been listening to and really enjoying. And this one is such a departure. Yeah, it's about the journey. I'm with these guys.
yeah.
I don't know. I thought they were just a straight rock band and doing their thing and making it Sparks. This is something very different. And so that hooked me into being, I think, the lifelong fan that I am.
And I love the fact that Tony Visconti, he still is so in love with Indiscreet, and that whole time in his flat in Hammersmith where they came to rehearse.
But what do you think about Muff Winwood's comment then, since we're talking about Indiscreet, that was designed with America in mind? Because they thought that would help break them. And to me, that comment just shocked me.
No, it seems more, one of their most European albums. I mean, it would have made more sense to go straight from Propaganda into Big Beat, because they're sort of part of a piece. It's different, it's rocking, but it's still that rawness. Whereas you look at that, just how ornate those arrangements are on Indiscreet, and how far out Ron's lyrics have gone already. I mean, let's be honest, they weren't exactly in to start with, but they've gone further out already. And it was that joy. The thing within Indiscreet is you can almost hear the confidence of them recording it. They've done well. They've succeeded. Now we got a bit of money. Now we got
Exactly,
a gatefold sleeve.
exactly. And my perspective on that is, and this is based on no actual knowledge, but my impression is that Indiscreet is really the logical successor to Woofer.
Yes.
That the other two albums, I think they loved them, they embraced them, they appreciated how well they were received, but now they had the chance to just do what they wanted to do for the first time in years. They really could just go all out with 100% carte blanche control, and they kind of picked up where Indiscreet, where Woofer left off, but with one of the greatest producers in the world. But I love James Lowe, so I don't want to give the wrong impression there. But
no. I mean, I think everybody. I'm trying to think who might not have done. I don't know, but it was almost like everyone brought their A game when they were working with Sparks. Muff said that in that interview. It's like in that room, everyone's on form, and you look at when Moroder had them. You look at when even the album afterwards, when what was it, Harold Faltermeyer was doing it. It's still incredibly well made. I mean, I even think Introducing, which I know has a sort of indifferent rap over the years. Again, if that had been their only album, people would be seeing it as this great lost classic that would change hands for like $500, and
it's an amazing album,
because it's almost like every album they were making was just so good. It was almost too good for the public in that sense.
One of the things I loved in your book, by the way, was, just moving from Indiscreet a little bit, was the great praise that you had for the song Change. And you used such an interesting word. You said the kernel of Little Beethoven. I don't know if the very last episode we discussed that exact song. Had I known you were such a fan, I should have invited you on the show. That would have been wonderful. But I agree with that. It is an amazing song. And you call it the best work of their 80s, I believe, in the book, or up there.
Well, you have to bear in mind that we didn't have Sparks in the way you had Sparks in the 80s. They disappeared, and we had so much of our own phenomenal pop at that time. It was a bit, you see the occasional picture and things, and it was a nice sort of good luck to them, glad they're doing it, because they'd left that very Terminal Jive for me will always be a very British album, mainly just because of the cover. It's set on Victoria Station, and it's there.
You're very generous toward Terminal Jive, I've noticed. Much more generous than I think I am.
No, I'm not. I mean, Young Girls I could never hear again quite happily, but I think I always, being 14 when it came out, I always thought whenever I fall in love, I'm going to put When I'm With You on a tape for, on a cassette for the girl, for my girl. And I
Sure.
did years, later. But that I mean, there's the halo effect of that song, because that song is like one of the greatest things they ever made, and the rest of the album you put up with because of that song being so great.
All right.
Anyway,
So back to
um,
Change.
Change. I think when they came out, so '85, it was around the time of Live Aid. Pop had become much bigger, bloated. Some people would say it was the era of the backing singers, the horn sections, the floppy tailcoats, the big hair, and suddenly they appeared on the TV show Terry Wogan, who was like our Johnny
Sure.
Carson type figure, and it was literally like, I don't know, a school reunion or something. It was two old mates had suddenly reappeared, who looked fundamentally the same,
Right.
still making this fundamentally weird music, but with all, I do think it's the Colonel Little Beethoven, because you've got all that sort of weirdness to it, and you've got the different time structures, and like London records at that time were riding high with like big pop successes like Bananarama over here and things like that. And it's a bit like, I want
But
Sparks.
but do you think they were also saying that the '80s thing had run its course and we're going to change?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's wholly possible. I mean, again, as I say, we didn't know, we hadn't heard what that sucker or angst in my pants. They just didn't didn't register here at all. So in a way, it was like the first thing we'd heard at the time since Terminal Drive, and it was so different. And then, of course, they disappeared again. That was the other
Right.
thing. And then we didn't hear. Of course, we know other things happened and other releases happened, but no one knew them until Gratuitous Sax came out, and then this sort of homecoming, and then finally seeing them live, because obviously they
Yeah.
hadn't played live since over here since '75, and it was
Yeah.
suddenly like, I'm going to go and see Sparks in concert and hear those records. And and so I think Change was that marvelous pivot for us, because we didn't have any of the other story. It was like 1980, 85, 93, 94.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it was a fascinating period that, from in my mind, from that really going back to Sparks in Outer Space, which was the first thing that they produced on their own, really started to
Mm,
deal with the synthesizers and getting away from the band sound a little bit, all the way to 2002 is quite a fascinating journey to me. You know,
definitely.
yeah, that kind of gets us to something else that I wanted to talk about with you, because in the book you say they've been around a lot of genres but never really part of them. And you also say something that I found so wonderfully interesting. Their music and personas make people smile, and then their art challenges you.
Hmm. Well, it's what makes them fascinating, and I think it's what's given them their longevity. And I think, again, we go back to growing up in the novelty shop. I think there is something, if you disarm people, if you bring them in, with a smile, with a gag, with a joke, um, you know, providing, you know, it's not a terrible joke or you've got a horrible smile. You've already disarmed people, and I think that's what they're able to do. And then, they can get the message across or the art across. And when you think, something like "Can I Invade Your Country?" They don't go, politics often, but you sort of know. Well, I'd like to think I know where their politics are, and
Well, I
and
think they've made it clear on their last album,
yes, yeah, no, they
really
have
the
now.
last two or three. But
Yeah, no, it's true. But I mean, at that point, and it's there, and it's like, actually, you listen to these words, and they're really serious. But there's a sort of double entendre in the title, and it's a bit light-hearted. So I think they've done that really well from their art, their films, their stagecraft, all of those things. And I think you said this very well with Paul, who amazing dissection of the songs, is that if you want them to be a pop band and you want a good night out, you can have that. But if you then want to go back and take it all apart and see how it fits and see how, you know, the very fact, I mean, that's their name, but Mail, you know, the corruption of Mail, you know,
Yeah.
the American Mail, they've challenged what an American Mail has been since day one. And that is just fascinating in itself if they did nothing else. But the
Well,
way, sorry,
no,
go on.
I was going to say, well, I think that, I, I was just going to say that if you look at the title of this show, Entertainment and Art, I
Yeah.
think that's one of the things that fascinates me is that there is an artistic element, whether it's to the degree that Paul might describe and believe, or whether it's maybe a little bit less, but nonetheless there in very prominent ways. That's really one of the most fascinating things about them to me.
I mean, I've never met um, an unintelligent Sparks fan. And I'm, you know, no criticism of unintelligent, because I hope there are, you know, everyone doesn't have to be intelligent, but, you know, they're obviously, and that's why Sparks are a cottage industry and they're not, you know, Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band. You know, they work here because they are spiky, they are obtuse, they do have all those things going on, and you know, they could have done that if they'd wanted to. Bruce isn't the best, you know. You like a big stadium band because Bruce is too much conscience and too much thought behind it. But you know what I mean. And but they chose against that, and sometimes circumstance chose it for them. You know, I think they'd have loved if Indiscreet had been a number one hit, and you know, as they often said, like Get in the Swing had been Bohemian Rhapsody instead of Bohemian Rhapsody, they might have just stayed there
Yeah.
forevermore. So I think it's now they're completely in control. Then I think the market sort of dictated where they were going a little bit.
I think until then, or really the late '80s, they really wanted to be a big successful band, but at the same time, they never let go of their vision.
No, and I think, you know, once they got the means of production, once they got that fact, you know, they were working on that sort of cottage industry thing that then became, you know, the internet made everyone able to sell records directly to their fans, and you know, do all those sort of things that they were already doing or starting to do then, and be this self-contained sort of entity working on the margins. And you know, and that's why they would be on the second stage at Glastonbury at, like, you know, 7:30 on a Friday night, and not on the main stage at Glastonbury at 10 o'clock on the Saturday night. You know,
Mhm. Well, still, it's pretty impressive what they did.
very impressive.
So let me just, as we wrap this up a little bit,
Yeah.
let me just ask you what led to the new edition of the book. That's we should talk
Well,
about that. We should hack the
it's
book a
it's
little bit.
it's a very I'd love to say it's marvelous. I couldn't wait to do it or anything like that. So the first one came out in 2010.
10.
Thank you, and Omnibus, who published it, suddenly realised over here book publishing, you know, things have to sort of go into paperback, small paperback form so they can be racked up and all those sort of things that happen in the modern world. So they said to me, because I've got a new book coming out with them very soon, I went in for a meeting. They said, "Oh, we're going to put your Sparks book out again." And I went, what, hold on, I need, you know, we're just going to put it in paperback format, it's out. And I said, well, look, you know, I've got to do something, because the 15 years since we last spoke, it's like, you know, I could do another book almost that size on it. So I did a lovely, well, I say lovely, a postscript to it. And it's great because they're out and about. They're doing the Green Man Festival in Wales. I think that's next week, and they're doing gigs around. And I say they're coming to the Cliffs in Southend, which will just feel so surreal that they'll be 2 miles from my front door.
That's so
Um,
wonderful. That's
yeah,
wonderful.
yeah. Do they get? Were you in Maryland somewhere like that? Do they?
I'm in Maryland, right outside of DC, so they come to DC pretty regularly. I did go to the UK last year with my wife, and we saw them in Manchester and London.
Oh wow! Where were they? In Hammersmith, weren't they? In London at the Apollo.
I believe so. Yes.
Hammersmith Odeon, as it used to be. Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. I mean, you know, the great thing is, you know, you're going to have an entertainment when you see them. Whether you're a fan or not, you can't help but admire, you know, what they do. And obviously, you've got to think, and you know, it's fascinating now. You know, what is the end game? We're now, Ron is 80, Russ is 77. you know, people can go on forever. You know, Macca's Dungeon Lane #1 and all of that at 84 now, but you know there is less, or they probably have made some deal and have the first record company on Mars or something, and they'll be up there,
No, that's how they're promoting their live album that's coming out. So,
isn't it?
or the moon. I'm sorry, the
The
moon.
moon. It's near enough. It's up
But yeah,
there
that is
somewhere,
a real question about what is the end game, because at some point there has to be an end game, and you know,
man.
at the same time they just keep going.
Well, you know, what I would love is like Elton did with his Goodbye Yellow Brick Road tour, is to do some statement thing, and then leaving them free to, if they want to, then turn up and do, you know, an acoustic performance. Like, you know, one of the best times I saw them was, there's a venue in London called the Union Chapel, which is an old church, and they were doing the Two Hands One Mouth tour at that point there,
Just
and
brilliant.
just seeing them in a church, taking it right back to that. So you know, you can still leave the way open for that, but almost to have the Vegas residency, or you know, it wouldn't be Vegas, they'd have somewhere far cooler and far more interesting, or like they did with London, to sort of, you know, do a formal goodbye, and then, you know, I can still see them going on for years.
Yeah. Well, do you ever think about actually writing a sequel to the book, catching everybody up on where they on the last 15 years?
Well, the thought certainly crosses my mind that they never cease to fascinate me,
Never.
and it's you know, it's been really interesting because I've in the interim, well, I've written several books, but I've just been spent quite a lot of time in the world of Slade, who never quite made it in America, famously, and it sort of cost them their British career for that point. But it's interesting, you know, both bands had their real high spot in the mid 70s, and obviously over here Slade have got these anthems that virtually everybody knows, whereas Sparks have, you know, This Town really, and a few more have #1. But that's sort of it. So it's very interesting to draw the parallels, because Slade on one level are artless, and you know, Sparks are the complete opposite, but both have, you know, a strong singular vision, and both have incredible strength of songwriting. And you know, it is fascinating that when you see Sparks next to Slade in '74, you know, it's just astonishing, because Sparks could have come from the moon, which brings us round to the new album very well. So
Yeah.
maybe I will do a follow up. Let us
Yeah.
see.
But in any case, I just want to congratulate you on having the book coming out again, and I'm
Thank
sure
you.
it's available everywhere.
At your local favourite retailer, and look at that new Juji sleeve going right back
Yeah.
there to
Yeah.
kimono, and but still all the same, slight easier to put in your pocket. Take it on holiday.
I hope everybody does.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. This has been wonderful. I feel like we could go for another hour easily. But
Careful what you wish for.
yeah, that's true. But I really do appreciate your time. It's been wonderful. Any final words besides buy the book, which is a very valid set of final words?
Really by the book. No, it's been an absolute pleasure, and it's just a joy to celebrate. You know, such an inventive, interesting, idiosyncratic, um, intelligent. I'll use that word again, but fun band, and daft. You know, I have a personal code of a very different. Zany to me is no, I don't do zany. I think that's it. But
No.
daft, delightfully daft. You know, you be daft because it's great. It'll get you through. But they got that with everything behind it, and
There's so much to them because they seem so genuine, you know.
oh,
But they
delightful.
have a great sense of humor and they write amazing songs. And somehow they put it all together and create this institution, as you said, that has lasted for what, 60 years now, 55
Well,
years. Yeah.
yeah, it's not far off it. I mean, I suppose if you did take those first demos, 68,
Yeah.
it is going to be 60 years. Right, on that note, before I feel too old, um, thank you so much for having me on.
Well, thank you for being on. And to everyone out there, go ahead. Why not hit that old subscribe button?
Like, it's down there somewhere, isn't it?
Do it down there. Do it for Daryl. You're not doing it for me, but do it for Daryl. I think he would really appreciate it, and I would too. But in the meantime, I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Daryl, I can't thank you enough. And
Thank
folks, we'll be back. That's it. Thank you. Good night.